media theory with science and technology studies. He has written widely cited papers on autonomous weapons from the perspective of just war theory and human rights and legal and moral issues raised by law enforcement robots. Professor Azaro's research also examines agency and autonomy, liability and punishment, privacy and surveillance, and it applies to customer robots, industrial automatization, smart buildings, drones, and autonomous vehicles. The research has been published in many international peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes and has been translated into French, German, Korean, Braille, and many other languages. Today, we are lucky, privileged, and honored to be able to listen to Professor Azaro's talk and lecture, Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. It will be delivered to courageous Karazinites by Professor Azaro to express his support for Ukraine, Kharkiv, and Vasil Nazarovich Karazin Kharkiv National University. This lecture is a part of the lecture series we are very honored to introduce this semester, and it will be the 13th within this initiative. We are very grateful, dear Peter, to have you with us today. We are deeply privileged. Thank you so much. Please, I'm happy to step down in your favor. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's humbling and honored to be able to speak to you today.
Thank you.
And I sincerest apologies for my tardiness. The Zoom app is not working on my laptop, so I'm on my phone. So I also apologize that you will not have my slides, but I will be sure to email those so that you can access them later by contacting the organizers of this talk. So my title slide, if you can see it, says Killer Robots at the United Nations. Looking at banning autonomous weapons. I wanted to talk a bit today about our efforts at the UN, and in fact, the meetings are going on today and all week at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons at the United Nations in Geneva. So I'm taking a break from the live feed of that to join you all today. A little bit of history on the campaign. In my own involvement, my background is in philosophy and computer science. I did a lot of research on early cybernetics, artificial intelligence, robotics, things like that. I was very concerned with the social implications of the implementation of these new technologies, and became very concerned about the potential for lethal robots and armed robots in the early 2000s. And I joined together with some other researchers in 2009 to form the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. And since then, we sort of were a bunch of academics trying to figure out how do we get the world to pay attention to this issue. And then in 2013, we were joined by a large group of humanitarian disarmament campaigners who've done a lot of work historically on banning landmines and cluster munitions, nuclear weapons, the arms trade treaty that governs small arms and things like that. So we formed a coalition of campaigns back in 2013 called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And my committee of the arms control is on the steering committee of this organization. And shortly thereafter, there was a report to the UN Human Rights Council from one of the special rapporteurs for extrajudicial execution, who'd been working on drones at the time and was very concerned about targeted killing, and also became very concerned about the potential for autonomous weapons. And I'll get into the distinctions and definitions in a minute. But the Human Rights Council in general doesn't like to deal with arms control issues, and they perceive this very much as an arms control issue, and so they didn't want to pick it up. But another body at the United Nations called it's a sort of a mouthful, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, because it was a treaty convention about all those weapons that are not nuclear, biological, or chemical. So those are the conventional weapons. but it's a standing body in Geneva that can and has regulated various kinds of conventional weapons over the years since it was created in the 1980s. Most recently, they banned permanently blinding lasers as a weapon of war. And we're hoping to get a protocol added to this CCW that would prohibit autonomous weapons. So they had a series of expert meetings in 2014, 15, and 16. Those were then elevated to what they call a group of governmental experts meetings that have been held annually since 2017. During COVID, of course, like everything else, the UN mostly shut down and reopened under sort of online and distanced and sort of conditions. And those were some challenging years. And then most recently, last year, there were disruptions in the discussions. So the discussions have been slow, and that happens at the UN. But the nature of this body, the CCW, is what they call consensus-based, which means all states have to agree on any output from this body, which means effectively that every single state has a veto power. And of course, most states are reluctant to use it, but not all. And so in 2022, what we saw defiance of the rest of the world, as you are well aware, Russia shut down the process of the CCW. They refused to accept the agenda to even start the meeting. They kicked civil society and the NGOs out of the room. But they basically demonstrated that they are no longer acting in good faith and that they will do whatever they can within their powers to stop a treaty from happening. So we've still carried out discussions at the CCW over the past year, despite this. But with knowledge of this, it's becoming clear to the states who are party to this body, the CCW, that we really have to go to some other forum to get a treaty and to negotiate a legally binding treaty. And there's a couple of options for that that have existed historically, because both the landmine and cluster munitions campaigns came to the CCW for many years and eventually went to another process. And for those, it was what's called an outside process, where a nation independently of the UN sponsors treaty negotiations on their own. And so you may have heard of the Oslo Treaty or the Ottawa Treaty. And those were instances where Norway hosted the cluster munition treaty, or Canada hosted the landmine prohibition treaty against personnel landmines. So we could find a country that would do that. What we've also seen even more recently is that the General Assembly of the United Nations can also pass and adopt treaties, and it requires a simple majority vote. A majority of states in the world would have to vote for it to pass, and then it becomes international law when a sufficient number of states sign on to the treaty and officially adopt it. And we've seen that work recently with the Arms Trade Treaty that governs essentially accounting for small arms transfers between countries, and also for the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which was a little more controversial, mostly because you had a situation where the nuclear states themselves did not sign on to the ban treaty, but we do have a majority of countries around the world who have signed a treaty to ban nuclear weapons completely. So that's sort of where we're at. And right now, the campaign to stop killer robots, we have 11 organizations, non-governmental organizations or NGOs on the steering committee. Overall, globally, we have over 200 NGOs who are members of the campaign, and those represent 67 countries around the world. And we've been putting pressure on governments and diplomats at the UN, essentially to negotiate a treaty that would prohibit autonomous weapons. Robotics has been advancing quite quickly. In the private sector, we got these self-driving cars and small drones and all kinds of little robots. Military robots are, of course, catching up with that. They've long been used, if you think about sort of guided missiles and things like that, as well as bomb disposal robots. But what we're seeing is greater autonomy. And autonomy is when essentially you pre-program systems to do certain activities rather than directly controlling them, say through a joystick or a controller of some sort. And in terms of defining an autonomous weapon system, we follow the International Committee of the Red Cross and their working definition of autonomous weapons, which looks at the whole sort of decision cycle in the military of when and how to apply lethal force against a target. And first you have to find a target, fix it, track it, and then you actually target an object and then engage lethal force in it. And on a human level, that's like pointing a gun and then pulling a trigger. In more technical sorts of systems, if you're in an aircraft, you may have a radar lock system that you would engage onto a target and then press a button or pull a trigger that would deploy, say, a missile or a rocket, something like that. But those are the sort of two critical functions of targeting, essentially deciding what is a target, and then engagement, which is the decision to use lethal force against that target. If those two steps are automated, which means that a piece of software, a program, an automated mechanism of some sort effectively makes the decision, and it's not a human being who's effectively making those decisions, then it is an autonomous weapon system. In terms of the history of these different technologies, we do have precursors to this, and we do have systems that do various forms of automated targeting, and even automated targeting and engagement. And probably the most common or familiar of these are going to be missile defense systems. So Israel has an Iron Dome system, the US has a phalanx system, as well as the Patriot missile system, a number of which have recently arrived and been used quite successfully in Ukraine. And these are all systems that, in one way or another, use some kind of sensor, like a radar in most cases, to identify incoming missiles, and then automatically targets them and launches a weapon to intercept them. So the Patriot missile system and the Iron Dome use rockets to intercept other rockets or missiles. The phalanx system is much older. It's been used in the Navy for a long time. It uses a rapid fire kind of Gatling gun system that just kind of sprays lots of bullets at the incoming missile. And the advantage of these systems is that they operate much faster than humans could operate. In many cases, what's happening is there's a huge kind of barrage of missiles. So there may be 5 or 10 or 20 or even 100 missiles sort of incoming at one time. And a human would find it very difficult to actually target those systems individually. And so autonomy functions in these systems to sort of automatically intercept and target these systems. However, and I'll come back to this in some more detail, there's always human control over these systems. They're very much under human supervision. The human can see the radar, they can see and recognize that it's an incoming barrage of missiles. They then put the system into an automated targeting mode for it to intercept those and then turn it off again. And usually these systems are in these autonomous modes for less than a minute, usually less than half a minute. most of the time in order to do their automated bit. The other systems that are really kind of precursors that you're also probably more familiar with are drones. And we saw the use of drones extensively by the US in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now, of course, you're probably more familiar with their uses in the Ukraine than I am, but they're being used extensively in Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, both by Russian forces and by Ukrainian defense forces. And these are a broad range of different technologies. They're mostly plane-like or helicopter-like, they small quad rotor, and have varying degrees of automation. So some of them you have to completely fly by human control. Many of the quad rotors have sort of automated stability systems, but you have to determine sort of its flight path. More sophisticated systems have autopilots that can be set to designated waypoints or GPS locations. Some of these are armed, many of them are not. Most of them are really used for surveillance and reconnaissance. I think they've shaped the war in Ukraine quite dramatically in terms of creating a kind of return to trench warfare and artillery and things like that because of the ability to do the reconnaissance with these small drones. They've made artillery very important, and that's been the sort of the main focus of combat in many ways. They also vary quite a bit in cost, and that becomes an issue over time. So many of the US's bigger drones, the Reaper drones that you may have seen, or Predator drones, are very expensive. They may cost millions of dollars, and would carry missiles, each of which might cost $80,000 to $100,000, and they could carry 4 or 16 of those, depending on the model. Whereas some of the smaller drones you can get for $100, and some of these are just consumer level drones. But there's been a lot of innovation around arming those, putting weapons on them and then flying them into targets. And then Russia has run out of a lot of their long range missiles and has been substituting drones, and particularly the Iranian Shahed 136 drone for long range attacks. And many of those have been targeting Kiev and Kharkiv quite extensively through especially civilian areas. And I think that's deeply problematic. Less problematic, of course, is the direct kind of military applications, and using these to target military targets, which falls within international law. Using them to target civilian areas very much violates international law and already existing law. So all of these systems I've described so far, however, are not autonomous weapons in the technical sense that we're concerned with, because there's still at some level a human who's designating the target. And that human is responsible. So when they designate a civilian target, there should be accountability for that. If it's a war crime, they should be prosecuted for that. Of course, it's happening with great regularity, and it remains to be seen how much we're able to enforce that over time. But there's a new generation of drones being developed that have much higher levels of autonomy. One which has occasionally been rumored to be used in Ukraine, but I haven't seen evidence of it, is a Turkish drone called the Kargu 2. This one is a small quad rotor type drone that has been programmed with image recognition and tracking, so that it looks for images that look like people and then flies into that. It can't really distinguish different people. It can't really distinguish different uniforms. It can't really distinguish combatants and non-combatants. All of which is problematic, but the system has been developed and has been deployed in Libya previously. So we're kind of keeping our eyes open for that. But there's a whole range of large drones that could be developed that would have automated targeting capabilities and things like that. And these are many of the concerns that we have. When we started the campaign 10 years ago, was that these weapons were, 5 or 10 years away. And now we're starting to see them not only being built, but starting to be deployed. So we still have a chance to have a preemptive treaty in the sense of most countries don't have these weapons, and we would still like to prevent them. As a side note, there's also a lot of confusion or concern around artificial intelligence. And as I mentioned, the sort of Kargu 2 uses pattern recognition, which is a kind of a classic artificial intelligence task. We have neural networks that do this work of identifying, cats or dogs in an image or something like that. And it seems like, well, gee, we could make these weapons more sophisticated. We can make them more precise and accurate by using lots of artificial intelligence and machine learning sort of techniques. So that is a way to make systems autonomous. It's not the only way. There's still, dumb autonomous weapon systems, and arguably a landmine is the dumbest of autonomous weapons. It doesn't really recognize anything about a target other than weight. And it doesn't really even understand weight. It just knows that it explodes when it's depressed. And that's a sort of victim activated system. You could make it much more sophisticated and put a camera on it and a targeting system and those sorts of things. But ultimately, the system isn't any smarter. It doesn't actually recognize humans. All of these are pieces of software, and you programmed it to some extent to be able to distinguish one set of patterns from another set of patterns. But it doesn't understand that that's a human, or what it means to take a human life, or even very often the distinctions between civilians and combatants, or adults and children, or farm tools and weapons. So there's a whole range of potential problems if we allow these kinds of autonomous systems to make these lethal decisions. So of course, you have these potentials for accidents and mistakes, and those would directly translate into civilian casualties quite clearly. There's also a potential for unintended conflicts and escalation of conflicts. So if you had, say, automated drones patrolling a border on each side, they could be blown into contact with each other and then go through some automatic sequence where, they escalate and retaliate and start firing at each other. And that could start a war. It could also be the case that an automated system could escalate a war from sort of one level of violence to a much higher level of violence, or employ weapons, or even say nuclear weapons or something like that. Overall, which is another thing that we've seen with drones, the main thing drones do is make it cheaper to do long range surveillance and to do long range attacks. It lowers the cost, which means you can increase the number of strikes and the number of targets. But it also means it lowers the thresholds to conflict. It becomes a lot cheaper to do these sorts of attacks and strikes. And this is something we saw with targeted killing by the US in Pakistan during the Afghan war, and also by Israel in Palestine. Because these systems could be very inexpensive, as well as expensive, but they're a digital technology, so very much like drones, we expect to see a rapid proliferation once these systems are developed, and those could proliferate not just to states, but also to non-state actors, terrorist organizations, and of course they could be used by governments against their own people for policing or to put down democratic protests or anything like that. There's clearly and already, I would say, a potential for arms races, both at the global and regional level. Right now, there's a bit of a race between the U.S. and China and Russia, and I would say Israel in terms of developing these systems, being the first to sort of own the space. But that's short-sighted, as arms races are, because the others will catch up eventually, and it leads to a kind of perpetual race. And where you have, in the case of, say, nuclear weapons, a sort of détente around globally around the development and use of nuclear weapons for many, many years, this could be destabilizing to that. Similarly, in regional areas, let's say Kashmir on the Chinese Indian border, where these systems might be deployed, could also create an arms race between those states or between North and South Korea, for instance. Another big concern around these systems, which is somewhat like cyber attacks, is that it could be very difficult to attribute attacks. Unlike a manned aircraft or a commando team or something like that, like it's a robot. It's flown by remote control. It may have a country of origin and manufacture, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what country or organization is using that system. It could be, acquired by a third party to make it look like a country is doing something. We've actually recently seen drone attacks on the Kremlin, small drones, but we don't know who did the attack. There's speculation, but it's very difficult to attribute these sorts of attacks. And that makes things like assassination and target killing much more sort of politically and legally feasible, because it's possible to execute those kinds of missions without anybody knowing who did it. But of course, because these are cybernetic systems and computer systems, they're also subject to cyber attack or hacking, being taken over by hacking. So you could actually have the weapons of your country taken over by another country and used against your own country, or again, a third party country. There's also what's called spoofing, which is most of these systems, especially these smaller drones, rely on GPS, which is a radar-based guidance and location system, which means you have to have radio connections to these satellites that are in space to identify your position. But those are not encrypted. And so if you get an antenna that's broadcasting at the same wavelengths close enough to a drone that it tells it that it has a different GPS coordinate than the satellite, well, it'll believe the stronger signal. And so then you can basically take over the coordinate system of the drone. And even though it thinks it's flying in a straight line, you can manipulate those coordinates to control it, to fly it wherever you want it to go. And Iran has successfully used that against some US surveillance drones. This is how they landed and captured some very sophisticated and expensive drones in the US. But it's quite easy to do with like DJI drones and things like that. But all that means these systems are going to be very insecure, which is scary and problematic. But the deeper issues, and these are the kind of more theoretical problems with autonomous weapons. By theoretical, they're actually, I think, more concerning to me as a philosopher, but they're a little bit less concrete. But one is this, what we call the accountability gap. And whenever you have automation operating, it becomes very difficult to identify responsibility for actions. So it could be the case that a robot system causes a bunch of civilian casualties and harm, how do you know the operator or the commander actually intended for that system to do what it did? They can claim they didn't know it was going to do that. Under law, it would be very hard to hold them accountable for war crimes because you have to prove the intention to commit the crime. And it's be very easy to defend yourself to say that wasn't my intention. I didn't expect what that system was going to do. So that any degree to which these systems are unpredictable or autonomous, it creates this accountability gap, which really ultimately undermines international law and our ability to apply international law, which is already being challenged, as I mentioned earlier, by the use of drones. It would be even further challenged in this case. And then I think there's a more fundamental threat to human rights and human dignity. And the idea that we would allow machines to make the decision to take a human life, that in some sense we're delegating that authority to a machine. And that's a machine that's not a moral agent, that's not a legal agent, who has no accountability or responsibility. And I think that's deeply problematic, both in warfare and beyond, if we start to think about the ability of algorithms to make all sorts of decisions about our lives, from what colleges we get into or what jobs we get, and so forth. And so at a fundamental level, these systems are dehumanizing. And I think that's pretty clear when you think about how they're actually doing targeting, by representing humans as some pattern of pixels or radar signals or whatever it is. That's not really what a human is, but you're effectively reducing a human to some set of data points and then making a life and death decision about them based on that. So I think it's crucial that we ban these systems, and we need to do this with an international law that's a binding law. Right now we have about 70 countries that are at the CCW that are supporting some kind of new regulation on autonomous weapons. More than 30 of those are explicitly supporting a treaty negotiation. Recently, we had a meeting in Costa Rica where 33 Latin American countries came together and Caribbean countries came together to call for a treaty negotiation. And that they were joined then by 3 EU countries as part of the Iberian group. The Portugal, Spain, and Andorra have also joined this communique. There was another meeting subsequently in Luxembourg. Unfortunately, we didn't get a similar statement from the EU countries yet on that, but we have strong support from Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, and some other Luxembourg, and some other European and EU countries and NATO countries. And NATO is already also thinking very much about how to manage all of this. So far, of course, the challenge has been the US, Russia, Israel, China, the countries that are developing these systems, and also develop most of the weapons systems around the world. So they have business interest in this, and it's not clear they're ever going to support a treaty or hopefully at least sign on after one is negotiated. So the next steps are really to see what's going to happen at the CCW, and then to see what's going to happen at the United Nations General Assembly this fall. We're hoping to have more discussions there, and then hopefully get a treaty negotiation. I know we started a little late, and I want to leave some time for questions, and I hope you have some questions for me. And I will be sure to also send these slides that you didn't get to see, so that you can question.
Dear Professor Azaro, thank you very much for this talk. We're so grateful. This talk has been of such I would say, huge importance to us because it's so integrated into modernity. It's so current, it's so vital. At the same time, it's so interesting, thought-provoking for all generations. And I would say to us in Ukraine right now, unfortunately, this topic is known not only from theoretical plane, but also from a practical point of view. Unfortunately, like last Friday, during the night, some of the cities of Ukraine, like Lviv and Khmelnytsky, experienced several explosions related to drones. And we are very grateful for you and happy to have you today at Vasil Karas and Kharkiv National University. I'm sure our audience has lots of topic-related questions, and I would welcome them to take the floor. I would be happy to step down in favor of our faculty and our students, who I'm absolutely sure have taken acute interest into issues of artificial intelligence, drones, robots, and the campaign Professor Azaro was talking about. Would you please, dear friends, would you like to join us in this discussion? I know we have colleagues, we have students today. Please. Dear Professor Azaro, do you see, how do you see the future of technology development, with your kind permission? And do you believe that, as well, at least in terms of literature and linguistics, there exists such an opinion that fiction written by good specialists in physics can predict the development of technology of the future? Do you agree with that? Do you agree that some of the reflection of what we are having today can be found in fiction that was produced in the mid-70s, mid-60s, and so on of the previous century? So to be able to have an insight into the future of the 21st century, we may carefully study the literature produced today. What do you think might be your opinion about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of science fiction and have been for many years. Yes and no, right? So I think one thing to keep in mind is that no technological developments are inevitable, that they're always a product of an emergence of social needs and technological innovations that in some sense are not predictable. In another sense, I think science fiction in particular gives us a vision for the future. And it gives us many visions of the future, most of which don't come to take place, but they're often very inspiring. And I think the best parts of science fiction have inspired scientists, researchers, technologists to build things. And we know in the case of satellites, science fiction writers were talking about them before scientists were thinking about them or trying to build them. The Star Trek communicator looks a whole lot like a cell phone. On the other hand, we don't have, teleportation, right? And we don't have warp drives. So, Star Trek didn't get everything right. They got some things right. They're not trying to predict, they're trying to tell stories. Another thing that comes up a lot in these discussions is Asimov and the 3 laws of robotics that he came up with, as well as the 4th or 0th law, which make for really good stories because these laws don't work. There's incompatibilities and inconsistencies that create narrative tension in the stories. But that's also something that makes them really bad to try to actually implement in robots. And of course, the first law is that robots should never harm humans, which is a pretty good guideline, I would say. And if we followed that, we wouldn't need to worry about autonomous weapons at all. But clearly, that's not happening. So, yeah, I think technology will move forward quickly, and increasingly so, and that's also scary in many ways.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dear Martha, we have a speaker who would like to take the floor. Martha, she's one of our students, constantly present at all the lectures we have. Martha, would you like to go on with your question, please?
Yes, thank you very much. I also wanted to ask about like sci-fi fiction. Recently, I read one book, and there was a question about like, can a robot develop consciousness? And it was an open question, and I'd like to ask, so how can we know if there is a consciousness, and what's possible like consequences of this? Is it like more dangerous, or is it like we can get some benefits as well? So I think I'd like to ask you like your opinion on this question.
Sure. Yeah, it's a common question. And I would have to say in my presentation, of course, I said, robots and machines are not moral or legal agents. And that, I think, if we developed a sophisticated enough robot or artificial intelligence that we determined it's conscious, and maybe more than consciousness, it has other characteristics that we require to say have rights or to be respected in society. So, my own view of biological systems, most animals are conscious, even worms to a certain extent have a degree of consciousness. We don't necessarily think of them all as being completely sentient, right? Or of having plans or of future, like future plans or memories. Like those may be more sophisticated than consciousness, much less things like emotions. And even very sophisticated animals, we're still sort of debating, what are the appropriate rights to give to, say, horses or dolphins or dogs. We definitely give them more respect than we give non-living things, and more respect than we give, say, plants. But they're not, say, full members of society. We don't let dogs vote or things like that. Right. And there's good reason why, like they don't understand society and they're not really part of society. So it doesn't really make sense to integrate them. So there's also, I think, a deeper question about why would we want to build robots that have rights and that integrate into society. And in many respects, the word robot comes from the Czech word for a slave or a serf or a worker, the robot there. We build them because we want slaves without the guilt of enslaving a person, right? We want a machine that will do the work for us, but not suffer under slavery. So why would we then want to build machines that would suffer, or that, that we would then want to give rights? And by rights, that means they have a claim against us, right? So would a robot be able to defend itself against us and then have reason to kill us and things like that? So that would definitely change. And then there's the sort of question of, one, how would we know? But two, how would we actually build it? We don't really have a good idea how to build it, or even really what the set of criteria would be for a robot to be a full-fledged member of society. And we really don't know how to build it. We're still trying to get systems that can understand language. Those, like ChatGPT is very popular at the moment. It can do certain things with language. This says actually means it's happy to lie and make up anything, because all it's really looking at are statistical properties between words in large sets of texts. And you can do a lot of amazing things with that, but it's not conscious, it's not understanding, it's nothing like the human condition.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. Thank you for the question, Marta, Miss Marta. Thank you so much. Do we have more questions, dear audience, who would like to join in the discussion? We've had such a fascinating topic to listen to. Dear Professor Azaro, and if I may, what was your first encounter with robotics? As I remember, I was trying to remember much from my past. I think it was in some of the stories by Ray Bradbury. Yeah. So what do you think? What was it for you? How did you develop your interest in such an amazing and diverse subject, if it's possible to ask?
Well, I snuck into the Star Wars movies underage when they first came out in the theater in 1977. So I'm dating myself a bit, but yeah, I mean that did it right there with C3PO and R2D2, and I mean the robots were the coolest thing. My grandfather worked at Zenith Radio. He was a service technician for televisions and radios, and he always had boxes of vacuum tubes lying around and things like that. But they owned Heathkit, and Heathkit made a little robot called Hero that was on a science show, and I always wanted one of those, but never could afford one. But I built a robot in the 3rd grade. For Valentine's Day, we had to make mailboxes for the Valentines. So I made a robot Valentine box that drove around the room on top of a remote control car. So yeah, it goes deep.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I guess we had, probably it was during the summer, or maybe at the beginning of spring, or maybe at the end of spring. I remember some of the Star Wars characters recorded a special message for Ukraine, in support of Ukraine. I think it was from Luke, from Mark Hamill, and also his voice was used to announce that the alarm time was off. So we got used to this voice, being associated with the movie itself, with this fantastic epic. Yeah, and during the wartime, it was also huge emotional support, like what we've received today. And thank you so much for it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your gusto. Thank you for your enthusiasm, and for such an amazing and original topic, which we have not yet had to deal with. And we hope so much that you will be our constant guest at conferences. We are very happy. We would be very happy to welcome you at all the future events we have that would be your topic related. And forever grateful for your support, for your time, and for everything that your country is doing in support of Ukraine.
Well, thank you for everything that Ukraine is doing. I'm humbled and honored to be here. Slava Ukraine.
The honor is all ours. Thank you very much for your time, dear friends, dear Karazin community. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for listening to our amazing lecturer, and stay safe, please. And glory to Vasil Karazin, Kharkiv National University, glory to Kharkiv, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the United States of America. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear Professor Azaro.